What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today. It's September 26th, 2024, and we've got another loaded slate of college football coming up this week. Week 4 was amazing, by far the best one that we've had so far, and now Week 5 has a group of games that may potentially top it. Before we get to Week 5's games, though, I wanted to quickly touch on the situation developing out at UNLV. If you didn't hear, late last night and early yesterday morning, the quarterback at UNLV, Matt Saluka, decided that he's no longer going to be playing for the Rebels, and that's due to an NIL dispute. And he came out with a statement on Twitter or Instagram or something, basically saying that he agreed to an NIL deal with UNLV that they weren't fulfilling, and that he was only getting like a fraction of what they had agreed to. Since that statement that he released, UNLV and the UNILV collective have put out statements of their own, basically saying that there was no agreement, that Saluka demanded more money than they were giving in a pay-for-play sort of way, which is against the NCAA rules. UNLV declined to give him more money than they had initially agreed to and what they were currently giving him. And as a result, he decided to leave and go get a bigger NIL deal from a different school. So if you haven't kept up with UNLV too much this season, they're 3-0, and they have 2 wins over Power 4 teams, both Big 12 teams. They beat Houston by 20 and Kansas by 3. And they're 3-0 for the first time since 1984, and are seeking to be 4-0 for the first time in program history if they can beat Fresno State this Saturday. So a very, very odd situation there. It straight up just sounds like they had a good start to the season. That quarterback, Saluka, was getting a lot of attention, and I guess maybe was told that he could get more money somewhere else, tried to get it out of UNLV. They wouldn't give it to him, and now he's going elsewhere. And this situation may loom pretty large down the stretch later this season, just in regards to not only the Mountain West, but the College Football Playoff Group of 5 representative. And if you don't know, with the 12-team College Football Playoff, a Group of 5 team, the highest-ranked Group of 5 champion, is guaranteed an auto bid to the 12-team field. So UNLV was heavily in that conversation, along with Boise State and Navy and Army, teams like that. But very interesting there. UNLV, we'll see what their backup quarterback can do and how they'll perform down the stretch. But very odd situation there, and I just wanted to briefly touch on it. The game of the week and the biggest game of the season so far. Number 2 Georgia travels to Tuscaloosa, Alabama to take on Kalen DeBoer, Jalen Milroe, and the defending SEC champion Alabama Crimson Tide. That game's at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ABC on Saturday. College Game Day will be there in the morning. President Trump will reportedly be in attendance as well, and all eyes will be on the Dogs and the Tide. Georgia is a 2-point favorite. The over-under is 48.5, giving us an implied score of 25-23 Georgia. This is the first time that Alabama has been a home underdog since Nick Saban's first season in 2007, when they were a 6.5-point underdog to number 3 LSU, who eventually won the national championship that year. Both teams are coming off bye weeks in their last games in Week 3. Alabama smoked Wisconsin 42-10 in Madison, and Georgia scraped by Kentucky 13-12 in Lexington. If you watched either episode I put out in Week 3, I mentioned that Georgia-Kentucky game in both of them and how I expected it to be close due to the Dogs' pattern of scoring in Lexington, and things went exactly according to that pattern. Not the best showing for Georgia in their last game, but also not a game that I really took much away from due to the fact that the writing was kind of on the wall in terms of how they score in Lexington. But Georgia's the only team in the country that hasn't allowed a touchdown this year. Alabama is one of just 5 teams who has allowed only 2 touchdowns or less. Both teams have had blowouts. Both teams have had close calls. Alabama made their game with USF look a little bit better, but that was a 1-point game going into the fourth quarter and a 5-point game with 6 minutes left, so still a tight one for the vast majority of it. Alabama has won 8 of the last 9 matchups against Georgia, with the lone loss coming in the 2021 National Championship, but all of those games were with Nick Saban as head coach. This will be Kalen DeBoer's first meeting with the Dogs, but he does at least get them in Tuscaloosa. That's going to be in an electric environment, always is, no matter where these two teams play, but that's really going to be a special one in Tuscaloosa on Saturday night. I've gone back and forth on who I think will win this game all throughout the season, and really even back into the summer too, when I was looking at the schedule and when that game started to get noticed as one of the first major matchups for the season. But over the past week specifically, I've changed my mind like 3 or 4 times while thinking about this game. It feels like this is Georgia's chance to really assert themselves as the premier program in the SEC. Nick Saban's gone. Georgia has those 2 national titles, but it's really always felt like Alabama was still the top dog as long as Saban was there, and we saw that in the SEC championship game last year. But losing the greatest head coach in college football history is certainly of note, and DeBoer's not new to these types of matchups, though. He's been to the college football playoff. His Washington team beat Texas, who took down Alabama by 10 points in Tuscaloosa last year. He's been to the national championship. He's been in heated rivalries like Oregon-Washington, and he beat the Ducks 3 consecutive times when the stakes were at their biggest. Georgia is, of course, a little bit of a different animal, but are they as good as the teams that we've been accustomed to seeing in Athens over the past few years? They haven't thrown for 300 yards in a game this season. They haven't had a 100-yard rusher in a game this season, and they haven't had a 100-yard receiver in a game this season. They haven't been all that dominant along the lines of scrimmage. Alabama's had an easier group of opponents, but they haven't dropped off a whole lot from what they were doing last season. And they haven't had to play, Clemson, obviously. They played Western Kentucky, and their hardest opponent is USF or Wisconsin. So the biggest key to this game, in my opinion, though, is the running game. Alabama is currently 19th in rushing offense at 238 yards per game. Georgia is 84th in rushing offense at 145.7 yards per game. And now you can say, yeah, they had to face a defense like Clemson's, and they also didn't have Trevor Etienne in that game. But even against Kentucky, and they obviously called the dogs off against their FCS opponent, but it just still hasn't kind of felt the same as it has in years past. If Alabama can establish a running game, control the line of scrimmage, use both Haynes and Miller in the running back room, and then Milroe's scrambling ability as well, to rack up some time of possession, maybe they outgain Georgia by 70, 75 yards on the ground, I think is kind of a good number there. I think that'll lead to the Tide getting it done. Another major factor, of course, is always penalties and turnovers. These teams are basically equally penalized so far this year. 24 penalties called on Alabama, 25 called on Georgia. Those are tied for 68th and tied for 76th most in penalties acquired this season. Georgia hurt themselves badly last year with penalties and that fumbled handoff at the 10-yard line in the SEC championship game. But so far this season, Georgia is +3 in the turnover margin. They were +1 against Clemson, +1 against their FCS opponent, and +1 against Kentucky. They've played very, very clean so far and need a similar performance on Saturday to win this game. Prediction-wise, if you can't tell, I really don't have a strong lean whatsoever on this game. I hope it's a phenomenal matchup. I hope it lives up to the hype and gives us an instant classic type of Saturday night. But I'll go with the home team. I'll take the environment at Bryant-Denny Stadium. I think Jalen Milroe and the Tide might make one more play than the Dogs and defend their home stadium with a win. Next up, we have number 15 Louisville going on the road at number 16 Notre Dame. Another game with massive implications for the college football playoff, particularly for the Fighting Irish since they already have that loss on their resume. Notre Dame is a 6-point favorite. The over-under is 47.5. Implied score of 27-21 Irish. This is a game that last season, if you don't remember, Louisville dominated Notre Dame. It was 33-20, but it really wasn't even that close. It was 33-13, and the Irish scored a late touchdown with like a minute left to make it more respectable. But Notre Dame had 5 turnovers in that game, and Louisville's defense just ate up everything they tried to do. These teams have changed a lot since then, though. No more Sam Hartman for Notre Dame, who threw 3 picks in that game last year. The Irish now have Riley Leonard, the transfer from Duke. Louisville replaced quarterback Jack Plummer with Tyler Shuck, who has been very impressive. He transferred in from Texas Tech and has looked great throughout their first 3 games. And this game will be played in South Bend instead of in Louisville. One of the more interesting angles on this game is Notre Dame's relative inability to pass so far this year. The Irish are 108th in the FBS in passing yards per game at just 173.8. Riley Leonard has 1 passing touchdown, 1, through 4 games. He has more interceptions, too, than passing touchdowns. And that 1 passing touchdown was last week against Miami of Ohio. So he has 0 passing touchdowns against either Power 4 opponent that they've played so far in Texas A&M and Purdue. Louisville also has this pattern of performance against certain quarterbacks where it almost doesn't seem to matter who they play for or what season it is. They just kind of have certain quarterbacks' numbers. For example, when Sam Hartman was at Wake Forest in 2022, Louisville picked him off 3 times and beat his, at the time, number 10 Wake Forest team by 27. And then last year, he transfers to Notre Dame, and he throws 3 interceptions again against Louisville, and they really got dominated in that game. Like I said, they had 13 points until the final minute. In 2 games against Louisville with Duke, Riley Leonard is 0-2 with losses by 40 and 23. Last year against the Cardinals with the Blue Devils, Leonard was 9 of 23 for 121 yards, 0 touchdowns, and a pick, and they were shut out 23-0. He also had 10 carries for 13 yards in that game, 1.3 yards per carry. And now this was after his ankle injury that he ironically suffered against Notre Dame, but he came back later in that season, and this was in that portion of games. But that was really more of a dominant performance by Louisville than it was the injury hampering him. So it'll be interesting to see if the Cardinals have a similar plan to contain him again. The Irish do have a very notable edge in the running game, though, averaging 238 yards per game compared to Louisville's 194 per game. Leonard has 6 rushing touchdowns, running back Jeremiah Love has 4, and Jadarian Price has 2. Going back to the passing game, this time for Louisville, Tyler Shuck has thrown for 850 yards and 8 touchdowns through 3 games. In the receiving room, this is absolutely ridiculous, but Louisville has 9 different players averaging over 11 yards per catch. 9 different players over 11 yards per catch. Most notably, wide receiver Chris Bell, he has 6 receptions for 167 yards and 2 touchdowns, averaging 27.8 yards per catch, which is the 3rd highest yards per catch of any receiver in the country. Shuck's 8 touchdown passes have been evenly distributed in 2s to 4 different players. 2 for Ja'Cory Brooks, 2 for Chris Bell, 2 for Jaden Thompson, who's actually out for the season with an injury. He suffered that last week. And 2 for tight end Mark Redmond. So that Louisville passing attack against Notre Dame's secondary and guys like Xavier Watts and Benjamin Morrison is going to be a phenomenal battle. One other big thing about this matchup is that Louisville's only played 3 games. They already had their bye week. Notre Dame's played 4. Louisville's only played 1 Power 4 opponent. Notre Dame's played 2. Louisville beat Georgia Tech by 12 last week, but that was a game that they very easily could have lost without some major mistakes from the Yellow Jackets, like Haynes King trying to throw a ball laterally while being tackled. Then the pass is ruled a fumble and taken into the end zone by the Cardinals. Stuff like that. It was a very, very strange game. Louisville had just that 1 Power 4 challenge last week, and this is their first road game of the year. The thing about that is Notre Dame's actually played better on the road and worse in South Bend. They beat a ranked Texas A&M team by 10 on the road in Week 1, and they beat Purdue on the road by 59 in Week 3. At home, they lost to Northern Illinois 16-14, and then beat Miami of Ohio 28-3. But that was a 1-score game for almost all of the first half with the Miami of Ohio Redhawks. So Miami of Ohio, they also missed a field goal and threw an interception in Notre Dame territory during that game. So it could have been even closer. The Irish were a 28-point favorite, won by 25. Didn't cover, but I guess it was about as expected. So as strange as that may sound, Notre Dame's actually played worse at home this year, but the Irish are in a position similar to that of Michigan last week, where they came into the season with very lofty ambitions. The college football playoff semifinals, even that big gold trophy, and they already have a loss, and now they have a ranked team coming into their building, and pretty much everything that they set out to accomplish hinges on this game, and we're not even out of September. Similar to Georgia and Alabama, this is a game that I don't have a very strong lean on either way. I do think Louisville has more of a chance than what I've heard from some of the national media, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it was a 3-point game with like 2 minutes left or something, and Notre Dame scores a touchdown to seal it and cover. I'll go with the underdog, though. Louisville certainly had their number last year, and maybe they can replicate some of the things that they were able to do successfully in that game. So Jeff Brom is a very underrated head coach, and I think he'll have his guys ready for this matchup. I'll take the Cardinals to escape with a win. Number 20 Oklahoma State travels to Manhattan, Kansas for a massive one in the Big 12 with number 23 Kansas State. Both teams are coming off major losses in conference play last week, and both are looking to bounce back in a big way on Saturday to keep their conference title hopes alive. Kansas State is a 4.5-point favorite. The over-under is 55.5, giving us an implied score of 30-26 Wildcats. So this is a noon kick on ESPN and a major game in the Big 12 conversation. For Oklahoma State, every week this season so far, I've kind of gone into it feeling like, okay, maybe this is the week that Ollie Gordon finally starts to look like Ollie Gordon again. And the Cowboys finally remember how to run the ball. And so far, that just hasn't occurred. Oklahoma State is 115th in the FBS in rushing yards per game, with the reigning Doak Walker Award winner for the best running back in the country at running back, and averaging just 96.2 rushing yards per game. The only Power 4 teams worse in that category are TCU, Colorado, and Florida State. Kansas State, on the other hand, is 15th in rushing yards per game with 240.2 per game. Defensively, in terms of rushing yards per game allowed, Kansas State is also 15th, allowing just 83.2 per game. In addition to not being able to run it, Oklahoma State has also struggled to stop the run, giving up 180.2 rushing yards per game, which is 101st in the FBS. So Oklahoma State is 115th in rushing yards per game and 101st in rushing yards per game allowed. Kansas State is 15th in rushing yards per game and 15th in rushing yards per game allowed. Then in the passing game, which carried Oklahoma State to all three of their wins, Kansas State has allowed just 4 passing touchdowns the entire year, an average of 1 per game, and those were divided up into 0 against their FCS opponent, 2 to Tulane, 0 to Arizona, and 2 to BYU. With all that being said, these two teams have been two of the hardest to get a pulse on all year. So it really wouldn't shock me if maybe this was the week that Oklahoma State gets things going on the ground, and maybe it took losing a game and really getting dominated by Utah for the majority of that game for things to change. For Kansas State, losing by 29 is a bit of a shock to the system, and it'll be really interesting to see how they're able to respond to that loss to BYU. The last time Oklahoma State made the trip to Kansas State, they lost 48-0 in 2022. That is, however, the only time that they've lost to the Wildcats in the last 5 years. They won 4 of the last 5. This is a game that I can really see going either way. And even though a lot of the stats, pretty much all of them, point to Kansas State having major edges in certain aspects of this game, I don't think it's that cut and dry. And like I said a minute ago, these two teams have been very hard to predict and haven't met a lot of expectations that they had going into the season. And I think that trend continues in Week 5. I'll take Oklahoma State to defeat Kansas State in Manhattan. Not my strongest feeling on a game, but I also wouldn't be surprised if the Wildcats won it. But I do feel like this is the week that Oklahoma State might just get things turned around. Next up, we have number 19 Illinois traveling to number 9 Penn State. A game not on most people's radar coming into the season, but one that has developed into a somewhat intriguing matchup here in Week 5. Penn State is an 18.5-point favorite. The over-under is 47.5, giving us an implied score of 33-15 Nittany Lions. This is a 7:30 p.m. Eastern kick in Beaver Stadium. That environment's going to be crazy, and the people out in Vegas think that the Illini are going to be overwhelmed. However, a lot of the public is bought into what Illinois did last week in Lincoln. According to some of the early data that's available, 87% of action on this game is on Illinois plus 18.5. They did go on the road into a hostile environment at night last week. Nebraska was celebrating their 400th consecutive sellout, and they ruined that party. 76% of the total money, though, is on Penn State. So the people putting the most on it are going with the Nittany Lions for what that's worth. Now, the team that Illinois is facing this week is a bit of a different caliber than Nebraska. Penn State beat Kent State 56-0 last week. If you watched last week's episodes, I've said it a couple times, but Kent State is the worst team in the country according to the ESPN FPI. And not that the Nittany Lions could overlook them, which they certainly did not, but there's also probably been some preparation going on for the Illinois game at Penn State for upwards of a week. Both defenses have been very strong this year. Illinois is allowing 12.5 points per game, which is 15th in the FBS. Penn State is allowing 13 points per game, which is 21st in the FBS, so very comparable there so far. I think Penn State will win this game. I don't think Illinois is quite ready to go into Beaver Stadium at night and win there yet, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it was closer than what most people are expecting. 18.5 is a lot of points, And with Illinois' defense being their strong suit, I think they can force a couple stops, take this game into the second half and be relatively competitive. Week 5 also brings us a very underrated matchup between Washington State and number 25 Boise State. Washington State is the first team in the receiving vote section of this week's top 25, which means that they are technically number 26. So number 26 Washington State at number 25 Boise State, a game that I'm really looking forward to. Boise State is a 7.5 point favorite. Over-under is 64.5. Implied score of 36-29 Broncos on that blue turf in Boise. The Cougars are coming off that ridiculous 54-52 double overtime win over San Jose State. John Mateer has been incredible for them at quarterback. He had over 500 total yards last week. Ashton Jeanty's been almost unstoppable for Boise State. He has 586 yards and 9 touchdowns through 3 games. They only gave him the ball 11 times last week against their FCS opponent, and he still had 127 yards. I have both Mateer and Jeanty in my Heisman Watch top 10 rankings right now, and this game has a lot of potential to be a significant step for both of them. One interesting thing about these two teams is that they share a common opponent already, and that's their FCS opponent, Portland State. Of course, the transitive property isn't always super reliable, but the statistical comparison and the similarities between the two are actually pretty interesting. Against Portland State, Washington State beat them 70-30. They led that game 63-17 and 70-23 at points. It was total and complete domination from the Cougars, but they put up 637 total yards. They didn't turn the ball over and scored touchdowns on 9 of their 12 drives. For Boise State against Portland State, they beat them 56-14. They put up 609 total yards and scored touchdowns on 8 of their 12 drives. So 2 very comparable performances against a common opponent. Boise State lost to their Big Ten opponent, Oregon, 37-34. Washington State did beat their Big Ten opponent in Washington, 24-19, but of course there's a little bit of a difference between Oregon and Washington. And the Cougars and Broncos, though, they've looked pretty similar so far this season. Ashton Jeanty has been a beast for the Broncos so far in every game this year, and that trend may continue with Washington State having the 83rd ranked rushing defense. The Cougars are allowing 151.2 rushing yards per game, and they're going to have their hands full with that Boise State rushing attack. On the flip side, Boise State's defense also hasn't stopped much either. Against the 2 FBS teams that they've faced, Georgia Southern and Oregon, they've given up 45 points and 37 points. The Broncos are 111th in the FBS in points per game allowed, so probably a lot of points in this one, and it should be very exciting. I've got no prediction here other than I feel like 7.5 might be a little much for Boise State. They do get them at home, but I'll lean Washington State to cover, but can see the final score going either way. All right, a couple rapid-fire previews. Number 17 Clemson hosts Stanford this week. Not a game that looked super interesting heading into last week, but after the Cardinal went to Syracuse and defeated Kyle McCord and the Orange in the JMA Dome last Friday, it's one that might be a little bit more competitive than expected. Stanford beat Syracuse. They beat their FCS opponent 41-7, and their only loss is by 7 points to TCU. So they've actually been pretty solid this season. That game's at 7 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. Clemson is a 20-point favorite, but it could be a little tighter than most probably imagine. Number 22, BYU, goes on the road to Baylor. BYU has held their first 4 opponents of the season, all to 15 points or less. The last time they accomplished that was 1984 when they went 13-0 and won the national championship. And the scores from those seasons are actually strikingly similar. So far this year, they've allowed 13 points, 15 points, 14 points, and 9 points. In 1984's first 4 games, they allowed 14, 13, 15, 13, and then in their 5th game, they allowed 9. So 13, 15, 14, 9, 14, 13, 15, 13, 9. Very, very similar between 1984 and 2024. Now, will BYU win the national championship? Probably not, but a very interesting start to the season in Provo, and we'll see if they can keep that going with a win over Baylor in Waco. The Cougars are 3-point underdogs. Number 21 Oklahoma goes on the road to Auburn. The Sooners are 2.5-point favorites. Both teams are looking to bounce back from losses last week. Oklahoma will be starting true freshman Michael Hawkins Jr. at quarterback instead of Jackson Arnold. Hawkins took over about halfway through their game with Tennessee last week after a very rough start for Arnold. Auburn's also experiencing some quarterback troubles of their own. They started backup Hank Brown last week, but he was just 7 of 13 for 72 yards and 3 interceptions before they pulled him and put back in Peyton Thorne. He was much better, but he also had a day a couple weeks ago against Cal where he threw 4 interceptions. So a very interesting quarterback situation on both sidelines in Jordan-Hare on Saturday, and potentially a pretty exciting game. On Friday night, Virginia Tech travels to number 7 Miami. This was a game that felt like coming into the season was going to be huge for the ACC race, and it still may be, but the Canes are a 19-point favorite. The Hokies are coming off a loss to Rutgers, their second of the season. But historically, these two teams have played a lot of close games, regardless of their respective calibers. Virginia Tech is actually the team who ended Miami's 39-game regular season win streak back in 2003, when the Canes were number 2. Their last 4 games have all been decided by 12 points or less, and 3 of the last 4 have been decided by 1 possession. There's also a family aspect to this game. Miami quarterback Cam Ward and Virginia Tech quarterback Kyron Drones are actually cousins, so not only a very meaningful conference game, but also some family bragging rights on the line as well. We also have Arkansas taking on number 24 Texas A&M in Arlington on Saturday. The Aggies are a 4-point favorite, a battle of two teams very much trying to find themselves and establish a foundation to build off of for the rest of the season. Texas A&M played a tight one with Bowling Green. They won 26-20 last week, and Arkansas outlasted Auburn in that very ugly, turnover-riddled game for both teams. An interesting game here that could potentially have some bowl game ramifications down the road for both programs. Colorado makes the trip to Orlando to take on UCF at 3:30 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. The Knights are 14.5-point favorites because of a few notable advantages that they have in the running game. UCF has the number 1 rushing offense in the country heading into Week 5. They average 375 rushing yards per game, and as a team, they average 6.8 yards per carry, which is the 4th highest of any team. Colorado's rushing defense is 82nd, allowing over 150 rushing yards per game. So this is really as simple as, can Colorado put together a couple defensive stops, or will UCF just ground and pound until the clock runs out? And with that rushing offense, they usually control time of possession, so Shedeur Sanders in that offense is going to have very limited attempts to score. A very interesting matchup of two teams that are polar opposites in offensive approach. Colorado is almost entirely passing, and UCF leans very, very heavily on that running game, so an interesting one in the Big 12 this week. We also have North Carolina at Duke, the best basketball rivalry in the country, but it has a little bit of a different feel to it in football. The Tar Heels look to bounce back after having 70 points hung on them by James Madison, and the Blue Devils look to start 5-0 for the first time since 1994. Duke has started 4-0 5 different times since 2014. But that 5th win has been very elusive. We'll see if they can pick it up on Saturday. And lastly, Liberty goes on the road to App State, a very intriguing game for the Flames in terms of their chances of being that Group of 5 college football playoff representative later this year. With their strength of schedule the way that it is, they really can't afford to lose a game at any point and still be in contention for that G5 CFP spot. So a very important one here on Saturday, as all of them are for Liberty. And they're just a 3-point favorite on the road in Boone. All right, time for this week's picks. I've said it pretty much every episode, but if you don't engage in any wagering on these games, just keep it that way. If you do, be smart about it. Don't believe what you see people posting on social media and stuff. A lot of that is legitimately fake and designed to lure people in. And these commercials that they run right now showing people winning, yeah, there are some people that win, and fortunately we've had the pleasure of doing so a lot this season, but there's far more losing than there is winning, so don't feel like you're missing out on anything. If you don't care to do it yourself, but maybe find the concept of it interesting, definitely stick around for a few minutes. But if you don't want to hear about it at all, feel free to check out now. If you didn't get to watch the Week 4 recap episode, I highlighted the fact that in Week 4's picks, we went 7-1 with the picks that I gave out in the Week 4 preview episode, and 8-1 overall with the extra pick that I put out on Twitter on Saturday morning. So it was an awesome week. It was a week that was very kind to us, and hopefully in Week 5 we can replicate some of that success. First up for Week 5, we've got UConn minus 5.5 against Buffalo. Buffalo's coming off that huge win over number 23 Northern Illinois last week, and UConn was a winner for us last week when they were a 2.5-point favorite over FAU and beat them by 34. That was a 2.5-point spread, and they won 48-14. So that was probably my lock of the week. I saw that line and was like, yes, please, thank you. And I really think the Huskies are undervalued right now. They lost bad to Maryland in week 1. They lost to the Terrapins 50-7. But since then, they hung 63 on their FCS opponent, 48 on FAU, and nearly beat Duke. So I'll take UConn to cover 5.5 over Buffalo. Then we've got Western Kentucky at Boston College over 54.5. Most people's last memory of Western Kentucky is probably them getting beaten 63-0 by Alabama in week 1. Since then, however, they benched quarterback TJ Finley and put in Caden Veltkamp, who was a King of the Week 2 weeks ago, after he went 27 of 30 for 398 yards and 5 touchdowns on Middle Tennessee. And last week, the Hilltoppers beat Toledo 26-21. That's a Toledo team who was coming off a 41-17 victory over Mississippi State. Boston College continues to impress. They beat Michigan State last week in a rainy, sloppy, wet game, but they got the job done 23-19. And between Castellanos at quarterback for BC and Veltkamp at quarterback for Western Kentucky, I have a feeling we can get over 54.5 points in this one. Next, we're taking NC State minus 5.5 against Northern Illinois. The Wolfpack have not had the season that they were hoping for so far this year, but even in their blowout loss to Clemson last week, I did see some things out of quarterback CJ Bailey that I think the Pack can build off of. Last week against Clemson, keep in mind this is a true freshman, CJ Bailey, in his first career start, and it's on the road in Death Valley. He started that game 8 for 8 and completed 10 of his first 11 passes. He finished with 204 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. They couldn't get much going until late in that game, but he also didn't have a ton of help. Most of that wasn't on him. They still have guys like KC Concepcion. They still have guys like Dakari Collins and Justin Jolie for him to throw to, and I think they'll bounce back this week. Northern Illinois is a solid team. They went to Notre Dame and took down the Irish, but I feel like NC State gets the win on Saturday, and I think they'll do it by more than 5.5. Texas State at Sam Houston State over 55.5. Sam Houston has quietly been one of the better stories in the country this year. And by quiet, I mean silent, because I didn't even know this until a couple of days ago, but the Bearcats are 3-1. And after moving up from the FCS to the FBS last year, they were understandably one of the worst teams in the country. They went 3-9 last year, and now they've already matched that win total at 3-1. Their only loss is to UCF, but outside of that, they beat Rice 34-14, Hawaii 31-13, and New Mexico State 31-11. They've scored 30-plus in every game against a group of 5 opponents this season and beat them all by 18-plus points. Texas State drew some attention during that game with Arizona State on Thursday night a couple weeks back, but they were actually favored to win that game, but ended up losing 31-28. So both teams' losses are to Big 12 opponents, and outside of those losses, they are undefeated against all the group of 5 teams that they've played. Texas State scored 49 on UTSA in a 39-point victory. Like I said, Sam Houston scored 30-plus in every game against a group of 5 opponents, so both teams can score, and I think we'll get that over 55.5. And lastly, we have Wake Forest minus 3 over Louisiana, as well as under 13.5 total points in the first quarter of that matchup. The Demon Deacons are coming off a bye week. Louisiana's coming off an 8-point loss to Tulane at home. Louisiana's 2 wins are over FCS Grambling State and Kennesaw State, who just moved up from the FCS to the FBS this season. Wake Forest lost by 1 point to Virginia. That was a game that Wake led by 13 going into the fourth quarter, and they also lost to Ole Miss. I think Wake will cover that 3-point spread. I love what I've seen from Hank Bachmeier so far this year. He's averaging over 300 passing yards per game, and I think they'll get it done against the Ragin' Cajuns. I also like that first quarter under 13.5 because both teams have gotten off to relatively slow starts this year. I think we'll see like a 7-0 or maybe 7-3 type of score through the first 15 minutes. That's going to wrap up this episode of the show. Really appreciate you tuning in and making it all the way to the end. A little bit longer this week. I think this is the longest one I've done so far this season. But yeah, a lot to say about week 5, I guess. So really excited for what this weekend holds for us, and hope it's a great week. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, and follow if you're on Spotify, and make sure to follow at CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.